Chapter 1. The village of Little Dithering was in its full midsummer bloom, and no day suited it better than the annual St. Mildred's Fair. It was a modest affair, to be sure, more bunting than spectacle, but the villagers took pride in its predictability. The vicar's wife had arranged the sponge cake competition, Mr. Elliston manned the bric-a-brac stall, and Miss Hartnell, flanked by two disinterested nieces, sold raffle tickets with the air of one performing divine penance. Miss Marple stood just outside the church hall's bunting-draped fence, her pale blue parasol tilted against the sun, and watched the fair with interest. Not excitement nor disapproval, but the gentle curiosity that suited her age and station. "Another year, another jam winner," murmured Reverend Allerton beside her, half amused, half exhausted. "Mrs. Randall Sapp's gooseberry preserves win again. She does use gin in it, you know, one's that say it. But we all know." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "There are worse secrets to keep, Vicar." The wind shifted slightly. Somewhere down the path a child screamed, not in pain, but the chaotic way children did when covered in treacle. Dogs barked. A teacup rattled and fell. Miss Marple Sipp's gaze turned toward the tea tent. Something had changed. It was nothing overt. No cries. No broken china visible. Oh, but people clustered. Not with interest, but uncertainty. Miss Marple watched them do the very British thing of not reacting too obviously. A whisper passed between Mrs. Finch and her friend Clara Willis. Elliston took off his hat. Though the sun was sharp as ever, the vicar's wife started toward the tea tent briskly, half pretending she merely wanted to check on the scones. Miss Marple lowered her parasol. "Do excuse me, Vicar." She walked steadily toward the disturbance. By the time she reached the tent, the crowd had parted ever so slightly. There was a young woman seated on a folding chair, pale and stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A tipped china teacup lay beside her. The spilled tea formed a crescent on the grass, staining the hem of her yellow dress. Mrs. Elliston hovered at her side with a damp napkin and no clear purpose. "She just fainted, I think," Mrs. Elliston was saying, her voice high with polite concern. "Perhaps the heat. It's terribly close, isn't it?" The young woman did not reply. She was Miss Ivy Reston, daughter of the retired Colonel Reston, and new to Little Dithering by less than 6 months. People said she had come from Bath, after some dreadful affair, a vague socially acceptable scandal of unknown dimension. She rarely joined the village gatherings, but today she had come, and now she had fainted. Miss Marple glanced down at the spilled tea. The pattern of the fall, the untouched scone, the way the girl sat so rigidly despite her pallor, it struck her as not the faint of a delicate girl, but the self-possession of someone who did not dare move. Miss Marple approached gently. "Dear child," she said softly, "you must come inside the church hall. It's much cooler there." Ivy Reston blinked. Her lips moved, but no words came. She stared at Miss Marple, as though trying to make out the expression on her face. She was sitting quite alone. Miss Marple offered Mrs. Elliston. No one saw anything really, just that she went pale, then dropped her cup. She didn't instead cry out. No, that's the odd part." Miss Marple touched Ivy Sepp's shoulder lightly. "May I walk with you to the hall?" Slowly, the girl nodded. They walked a few yards, Miss Marple's hand lightly supporting her. Several villagers politely looked away as they passed. A few exchanged significant glances. Inside the cool dim of the church hall, Miss Marple found a seat and a glass of water. She left Ivy Reston there, seated by the window, where the breeze passed lightly through the lace curtains. It was only when she returned to the tea tent that she noticed it. Just beside the table where Ivy had sat, half lost in the grass, trampled lightly underfoot, was a bonnet, a simple summer bonnet, white, with a pale lavender ribbon, the kind older women wore to protect against the sun. It was out of place. No one there had worn such a bonnet. Miss Hartnell never removed hers, and Mrs. Partridge wore one in green. This bonnet, crushed and oddly dirtied, had no clear owner. Miss Marple bent down. Gently she retrieved it. The inside rim bore a faint stain, not of tea, but something deeper, like rust or blood. But she said nothing, only folded it neatly and carried it home in her handbag. That evening, word travelled quickly through Little Dithering. Miss Reston had not fainted from the heat after all. A letter had arrived at her cottage, an anonymous one, and what was more, the doctor had insisted she remain under observation. The next morning, Ivy Reston was found dead. Chapter 2. News of Ivy Reston's death drifted through Little Dithering like the mist that rolled in over the meadows after dawn, soft, invasive, and inescapable. By midday, the village was abuzz in its usual restrained fashion. There were no wails, no dramatic scenes, just the sharpening of curiosity behind twitching curtains, and the murmur of lowered voices in the grocer's queue. "It's steps tragic, really," murmured Miss Hartnell to the vicar Sepp's wife, as they stood by the fresh bread display. "Poor girl. She never quite settled, did she?" "She was troubled," Mrs. Allerton replied delicately, adding a small tin of sardines to her basket. "There was something fragile about her. I always suspected she carried grief." "Or guilt," said Miss Hartnell, a little too quickly, then caught herself and smiled faintly. "Not that we should speak ill of the dead, of course." Over at the Green Swan Inn, the postmaster and the butcher had already formed a quiet theory, over 2 pints of bitter, that it was suicide brought on by heartbreak or worse, scandal. Word had it she'd received another letter the night before. The vicar hadn't confirmed it, but the doctor's visit so soon after the fair spoke volumes. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had said very little. She sat alone that morning in her cottage parlour, a cup of Darjeeling cooling on the table beside her, and the bonnet laid out on a folded tea towel. In the daylight, the stain along the inner rim was darker than she'd first thought, red-brown, and unmistakably crusted. She gently dabbed a corner with vinegar and salt, and the resulting smear was faintly rust-red. Not tea, certainly, and not jam. Blood, perhaps, or something meant to resemble it. She took no action just yet. Miss Marple believed in patience, especially when the village was still choosing how to react. Just before noon, a knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Partridge, flushed and breathing a little too quickly. "Miss Marple, have you heard about poor Miss Reston?" "I have. Yes," she said, motioning for her to come in. "Do sit down. My dear, you look quite beside yourself." Mrs. Partridge did not sit. She stood wringing her gloved hands. "There, something. I wasn't going to say anything, but well, people talk. Don't they?" and they start saying things. And I just thought, you ought to know. Miss Marple regarded her gently. Then perhaps you should tell me what it is, before you convince yourself not to. Mrs. Partridge swallowed. Except about the graveyard. Last night, I was walking the dog. Well, you know Toby. He steps an old thing, slow as anything, and we passed by the churchyard about 9:30 p.m. I saw someone, she whispered, near the western wall where the old graves are. They were bending over, like they sort dropped something, or were digging perhaps, but not with a shovel. Hands, maybe. Did they see you? I don't vet think so. I stepped back into the yew trees. I thought it might be the groundskeeper, though he never goes there that late. But it didn't feel right, Miss Marple. Whoever it was, they were wearing something white. A bonnet, maybe, at night. Who wears a bonnet at night? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She folded her hands on her lap. Did you recognize anything else? She asked at last. Height, build, tallish, I say, but hunched, and I can swear it was a woman. Just that odd flash of white. It moved like cloth. Miss Marple looked down at the table, at the bonnet, then back at Mrs. Partridge. Thank you, she said. You were quite right to mention it. Mrs. Partridge seemed almost relieved to have unburdened herself. She sat for tea, though neither of them drank much, and left soon after. Once the door closed behind her, Miss Marple remained very still. She had already decided, last night, that the bonnet must have been deliberately left. It was too out of place, too oddly crushed, to have merely been dropped. But if someone had been seen wearing such a bonnet, near the churchyard no less, then the timing was curious. And now, Miss Reston was dead. The cause had not been made official, that the doctor had not issued a public certificate. Instead, the police had arrived, quietly, but unmistakably, just after 10 o'clock. They had not gone to the Reston cottage. They had gone to the vicarage first. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual route to the church, ostensibly to tend to the flower arrangements inside the nave. But once her duty was done, she wandered slowly out toward the older part of the churchyard, where the graves leaned askew and the ground dipped near the yew hedges. The soil here was uneven. She stopped near the western wall. There, just at the edge of the grass, was a faint disruption, a small patch of earth, slightly darker than its surroundings, freshly turned, perhaps, not with a spade, with fingers. She knelt, slowly careful of her joints, and brushed away a few dry leaves. Nothing obvious met her eye. No stone, no buried scrap of evidence, but the ground had been touched. Someone had disturbed it, and not in the recent rain. This was last night's doing. She stood with difficulty, dusted her gloves, and turned back toward the village. That evening, a second visitor arrived. This time, it was Mr. Elliston, the widowed stationer. He was a fussy, narrow-shouldered man, with a fondness for rules and a mild terror of confrontation. He rarely called on Miss Marple without good reason. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, holding out a sheet of pale stationery. It was tucked in the church magazine returns, under the donations tin. Miss Marple took the sheet and read, "You cannot bury what is already known. I saw what happened, and I will not forget it." There was no signature. Miss Marple folded it carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Elliston. May I keep this for a while?" He nodded. Of course, I've just not shown it to anyone yet. Thought, well, best not stir gossip unnecessarily. She smiled gently. Wise, Mr. Elliston. But as he left, her expression changed. Two things now stood out: a bonnet, a grave, and now a letter, slipped quietly into a church tin, written by someone who had seen something, but hadn't dared speak aloud. It was not enough, not yet, but something was coalescing just outside the reach of certainty. Miss Marple returned to her parlour, placed the letter beside the bonnet, and poured a fresh cup of tea. Chapter 3. The following morning dawned with low grey skies, pressing over Little Dithering like a woolen shawl. It was the sort of day that quieted even the birds. Miss Marple stood at her window, one lace curtain pinched between her fingers, and noted the stillness with a familiar sense of expectancy. The village was holding its breath. By 10 o'clock, the news had spread that Inspector Graves from the county had arrived, not Sergeant Cocklestone from nearby Chipping Woodbury. Graves, that in itself. Trade deal. Graves was not summoned for garden variety misfortunes. His appearance meant one thing. The authorities no longer regarded Miss Reston's death as natural. Miss Marple took her usual seat in the parlour, with embroidery in hand, though she placed exactly 4 stitches before setting it aside. She knew Graves of old, methodical, competent, not lacking in intuition, but inclined to seek proof in statements and schedules rather than the more subtle theatre of village life. At 11:30, the first sign of his presence came not in uniform or inquiry, but in the measured tap of a boot on her path. The door opened to reveal Inspector Graves himself, a tall, stern man with a polished moustache and a gaze that lingered not quite long enough to be impolite. "Miss Marple," he said, with a courteous nod, "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes." "Of course, Inspector," she said, leading him in. "I spare a fresh pot of tea just made Indian, not Ceylon." He declined the tea, though with evident regret, and took the chair opposite her. "We have been reviewing Miss Reston Stack's cause of death," he began, folding his hands. "There's Stack's indication she ingested something unusual. Traces of digitalis from foxglove." "Digitalis?" Miss Marple repeated softly, "are rather hard to obtain in lethal quantities without knowledge." "Quite," said Graves. "More interestingly, we found no medicine in her home containing it, nor any prescription." Miss Marple tilted her head. "So you believe it was administered to her deliberately?" "We stir not ruling anything out," Graves said crisply, though his expression suggested otherwise. "I understand you were near Miss Reston when she first became ill at the fair." "I was. She had just spilled her became ill at the fair." "I was. She had just spilled her tea when I arrived. I don't believe she had taken more than a sip." Graves made a note. "And later, she was found deceased by her housekeeper, just before 8 in the morning. No sign of a struggle. Her cup was empty. She had received a letter the evening before." "I understand," Miss Marple added. Graves looked up. "You sec. Been well informed. Little Dithering is very good at whispering, just quietly enough to be heard." His lips twitched. "Yes, we did find the letter unsigned. It merely said, 'You, sir, not safe yet.' You know why." "Rather vague for a threat," Miss Marple mused, "but heavy with implication." Graves leaned forward slightly. Do you know of anyone who may have held animosity toward Miss Reston? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. She was not disliked, but she was not beloved either. People did not know what to make of her. Why? She did not quite play the part she was expected to, said Miss Marple. She did not gossip, did not confide, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, she listened without speaking much herself. That makes people suspicious. Graves was silent for a moment. We stood also looking into her past. Bath, I believe. There are references to a broken engagement, a scandal of some kind. Miss Marple nodded. That was spoken of when she arrived, but only in the vaguest terms. Graves rose. If anything further occurs to you, there may be one thing. Miss Marple interrupted gently, retrieving the bonnet from a drawer. She handed it over in a linen napkin. Graves frowned. Found where? Near the tea tent, just after Ivy Weston collapsed. I saw no one wear it that day, nor have I known it claimed since. It had been trampled and stained with something darker than tea. Graves unwrapped the cloth and examined it. I still send it for analysis, he said at last, his tone measured. Thank you. After he had gone, Miss Marple remained at the window again. The rain had begun, light but persistent, soaking into the earth like a whisper that refused to fade. By mid-afternoon, the village had begun to splinter into its usual factions. Those who believed it was suicide, those who whispered of poison, and those who insisted, most dramatically, that Ivy Weston had never belonged and brought something cursed with her. And at the Green Swan, old Mrs. Weatherby was heard to say, she walked like a ghost from the beginning. It sets no surprise she ended up one. But Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts. She believed in people and their terrible ordinary motives. At dusk, she made her way to the church once more. The graves were slick with rain now, the paths darker than usual beneath the clouds. She passed by the spot where the ground had been disturbed, and noted with quiet interest that the leaves she brushed aside had returned, fresh ones from the hedge above. Someone had come again. She turned almost absently toward the gate and stopped. There, beside the iron gate-post, was a torn scrap of paper clinging to the wet stone. That was part of a letter, the bottom half. The writing was jagged, blurred by rain, but legible. I can stay quiet. I know who left it. I know who was there by the grave. If you want the rest, come alone, after vespers, and don't speak of this. There was no signature, no location, but it was written on the same pale stationery as the letter brought by Mr. Elliston. Miss Marple slipped it into her handbag. It was nearly 7. Vespers would end at past. She turned back toward the lane with new resolve. Someone wanted to speak, but only in shadow, and shadows, Miss Marple knew, were not always where the danger waited. Chapter 4. The church bells of Little Dithering rang out across the village green, calling the faithful to vespers. Their chimes, softened by rain and fading daylight, seemed more mournful than reverent. Miss Marple, seated in the third pew from the back, listened with her head slightly bowed, though her eyes did not drift from the shadows near the side aisle. She had chosen a simple outfit, a grey wool coat, her smallest hat pinned at a modest angle, and carried only her handbag. Her presence here would not be questioned. Miss Marple attended vespers regularly, but tonight her prayers were silent observations. As the final hymn faded, the congregation began to shuffle out. Polite nods, low voices, the rustle of damp coats. Miss Marple remained seated, feigning difficulty with her gloves. She waited until the last footstep echoed out into the nave before rising. The church emptied. She moved slowly toward the side door, near the old vestry, where the stone walls pressed close and the air grew noticeably cooler. She stepped outside into the narrow path that curved behind the church, a forgotten passage between the belfry and the yew hedge. There, half shrouded by ivy, stood a figure. Miss Marple paused. "Excepts only me," came a voice. Female, soft, urgent. "Please, don't speak loudly. I am not supposed to be here." The woman stepped forward. It was Clara Willis, the niece of the vicar's housekeeper. Young, fair, and rarely noticed. Miss Marple had seen her at the fair, handing out flyers for the cake store and vanishing into corners when spoken to. "I don't have much time," Clara whispered. "I wasn't sure if you come. But when I saw you find the note—" Miss Marple regarded her with quiet patience. "It was you who left it." "Yes, and the first one, too. I couldn't say anything to the police. Not directly. But I saw something, Miss Marple, that evening, at the fair." "Go on, dear." Clara wrung her hands. "It was just before Ivy Reston collapsed. I was fetching lemonade behind the tent. I saw her talking to someone, but I couldn't make out the face. A man, I think, tall, wearing a dark coat, and he said something. I couldn't hear, but then she looked frightened, pale, like she might faint. Right then, and she turned away." "Did she see you?" Clara shook her head. "I don't think so, but I stayed hidden. I didn't want to be noticed." "Why?" Clara hesitated. "Because I knew who he was." Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. Clara Sepp's voice dropped further. "It was Mr. Henry Blackwood." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but her expression did not change. "At the solicitor's son?" Clara nodded. "He's come back from London. Some business with his father's office. But he and Ivy knew each other before. From Bath. I only found out recently, when I overheard them arguing near the lich gate last week. She told him to stay away. She said, 'I kept your secret once. I won't do it again.'" Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, but her mind quickened. "And the bonnet?" she asked gently. "And the bonnet?" she asked gently. I left it there, after the fair," Clara confessed. "I found it near the graveyard path, after the crowd had thinned. I didn't know if it was important, but it looked odd, dirty, like someone had dropped it running. I thought, if I left it near where she collapsed, someone might notice, someone like you." "You didn't see who wore it?" "No." There was a pause. "Miss Marple, do you think she was murdered?" Clara's voice trembled now, as if the word itself cost her something. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. "I think," she said quietly, "that Miss Reston knew something dangerous, and someone else knew. She wouldn't keep quiet." Clara looked down. "Will you tell the inspector?" "When the time is right," Miss Marple said gently. "But not before. Not unless it protects you." Clara nodded, then turned and slipped away into the shadows. Miss Marple stood alone for a few moments more, listening to the wind sift through the yews. That night, she took out her small notebook. She did not scribble theories or accusations. Miss Marple did not believe in guesswork. Instead, she listed observations in calm, clear lines. Ivy Reston had argued with Henry Blackwood. The folded paper was passed between them. Bonnet found near Grave Path, possibly dropped in flight. Clara Willis had seen both encounters. Digitalis poisoning, no known source in victim's home. Anonymous notes warned and confessed partial knowledge. Night before Ivy's death, unknown figure in graveyard, white bonnet seen. Recent grave disturbed again. She paused, then added, Ivy said, I once said keep your secret again. What secret? The next morning, Inspector Graves returned. He stood at Miss Marple's gate, with a firm set to his jaw. Miss Marple, he said without greeting, I need to ask about the Blackwood boy. Henry, she said mildly, motioning for him to step inside. Yes, he steps back. Temporarily, I understand. He claims he hadn't seen Ivy Reston since they both lived in Bath. Graves said bluntly, but we've received a letter from someone who overheard them arguing here about a past incident and a secret. Miss Marple offered him a seat. Do you suspect him? She asked. We're not ruling anyone out, but Ivy Sepp's cousin, Miss Celandine Reston, has come down from London. She claims there was unpleasantness in Bath, an engagement broken suddenly. Ivy left under pressure. The name C. Blackwood said came up. Miss Marple took this in without comment. I stopped like to ask you to speak with Miss Celandine, Graves continued. She refuses to speak formally, but she might speak to you. I should be glad to, Miss Marple said, rising. Some women only speak the truth when they believe it will not be used against them. Chapter 5. Celandine Reston did not match the name she bore. One might have expected a fragile petal-soft woman with a genteel disposition. Instead, Miss Reston was severe, angular, and dressed in a sharply tailored grey suit that gave her the air of someone accustomed to dealing with obstinate lawyers. Her hat was black, her tone was drier than salt. Miss Marple arrived at Ivy Reston's cottage, now temporarily under Celandine's care, just before 4 o'clock. The sitting room smelled faintly of beeswax and unopened letters. I suppose you still here for gossip, said Miss Reston, without preamble, folding her arms across her chest. The inspector said you'd call. I wasn't just inclined to speak to a police officer. Then perhaps it is fortunate that I am only an old lady, Miss Marple said with a smile, settling herself in the armchair without waiting to be offered one. And sometimes people find it easier to speak freely to someone who doesn't ask quite so directly. Celandine eyed her for a long moment, then poured tea with military efficiency. She was a fool, my cousin, she said at last, soft-hearted, too trusting, always thinking she could fix things. Miss Marple sipped her tea. You believe she was trying to fix something before she died? She was afraid, Celandine said flatly. It's not the same. You said not afraid, unless someone has reason to make you feel so. And you know who that was? No, said Celandine. But I know where it began. Bath, 2 years ago. She was engaged, briefly, to Henry Blackwood. Miss Marple set teacup, paused. Oh, yes, said Celandine, her voice tinged with bitterness. He was charming then. Of course he was. Tall, clever, good prospects. His father Sip's firm, respectable name. Ivy fell hard. But it didn't at last. What happened? She ended it quietly. She didn't tell me the reason at first, only that he had crossed a line. Later, when she came to live here, she told me a little more. There was a woman, another woman, whose name she never said, something about money. A threat, perhaps. Ivy said she had seen something she shouldn't have. Miss Marple remained still. She believed Henry was involved in something criminal, she asked. Celandine shrugged. Headers, I never knew. She spoke in pieces, hinted that she had protected someone, covered something up, but after she left Bath, she wanted to disappear. She came here because it was quiet, and he followed. Not until recently, said Celandine, her jaw tightening. When he came to the fair, she panicked. That's when the letters began. One arrived the very next morning. No return address. Ivy burned it before I could read it, she said. Only that someone was warning her, or perhaps threatening her. She wasn't sure. You believe Henry sent them? I don't know, said Celandine. But I know she was afraid of him, and now she sits dead. So draw your own conclusions. Miss Marple set down her cup gently. Fear, she said softly, often obscures judgment, but sometimes it sharpens it. I wonder which it was. In Ivy Sepp's case, Celandine said nothing more. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked to see Ivy's writing desk. Celandine allowed it with a nod, though she remained in the next room. The desk was neat, almost aggressively so. No scattered papers, no letters tucked into books or drawers, but inside the second compartment, beneath a faded blotter, Miss Marple found a small notebook. Most pages were torn out, but one remained. A single entry. If he threatens again, I'll go to Miss Marple. She sees things others don't. I don't want to die like this, knowing and saying nothing. Miss Marple closed the notebook and slipped it into her handbag. Outside, the clouds were beginning to part, casting long-angled light across the garden. Later that evening, she paid a quiet call to the Green Swan. It was just past 7, and Henry Blackwood was called to the Green Swan. It was just past 7, and Henry Blackwood was seated alone in the corner, reading the paper and nursing a whisky. Miss Marple approached his table like a grandmother might approach a wayward grandson. Mr. Blackwood, she said politely, might I trouble you for a word? He looked up, wary but composed. You stir, the one from the fair, he said. Marple, isn't it? I spave heard the villagers talk. Only the good bits, I hope, she said pleasantly. May I sit? He gestured to the seat across from him. Is this official? Not at all, Miss Marple said, settling in. Merely social. I find it helps, now and then, to speak with people who aren't after pretending quite so hard. He raised an eyebrow. And what am I pretending, Miss Marple? That you had nothing to do with Ivy Reston's fear? That your past connection with her was unremarkable? That you came here by chance? Blackwood exhaled sharply through his nose. She ended our engagement. That's not a crime. No, said Miss Marple gently. But threatening someone who knew too much might be. He stared at her. Is that what you think I did? I think, said Miss Marple quietly, that Ivy was caught in something bigger than herself, something she didn't just understand until it was too late, and I think someone, with a great deal to lose, wanted her silence more than her forgiveness. Blackwood's knuckles whitened around his glass. "You have no idea what she did," he said. "She was not as innocent as you all think." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple, "but she died, and the dead cannot defend themselves." He looked away. Miss Marple rose. "I stand sure Inspector Graves will want to speak with you again," she added, almost idly. "Do tell him I said hello." As she left the pub, she felt the chill of evening settle around her shoulders. She had sown just enough doubt. Now she waited to see who it made nervous. Chapter 6. By the next morning, the wind had shifted, bringing with it a bite of early autumn. In Little Dithering, even the seasons seemed to conspire with the mood of the village. Conversations were brisker, looks exchanged more cautiously. Ivy Reston's death had cast a longer shadow than most villagers were willing to admit. Miss Marple sat at her garden table, beneath a thinning vine of clematis, slowly shelling peas. She wasn't in need of peas, but the action gave her the perfect excuse to think. Her meeting with Henry Blackwood lingered in her mind. He had shown no surprise at Ivy's death, and yet his anger, controlled but unmistakable, had flickered to life the moment her name was truly brought into question. Anger often arrived when guilt feared exposure. At 10:30, a telegram arrived. It came from Inspector Graves, and was brief. "Man from Bath, inquiring about Ivy Reston. Name, Lester Grange. Says it's urgent. Refused to give details. Meeting at station 11:30. Thought you should know." Miss Marple stood at once, abandoned the peas, and changed her hat. By 11:20, she stood quietly at the edge of the small village station. Trains did not come often to Little Dithering, and when they did, they arrived with the reluctant sigh of steam and gravel, like a house guest who had reconsidered too late. A man in his early 40s emerged from the train, tall, sun-weathered, with a trench coat that had seen better years, and a newspaper folded too neatly beneath his arm. He looked about uncertainly, until Inspector Graves stepped forward and gestured toward Miss Marple. "This is Miss Marple," said Graves, "local resident and unofficial eyes and ears." Lester Grange gave her a tight nod. "Ivy Reston wrote to me." "When?" Miss Marple asked gently. "3 days before she died." His voice was clipped. She didn't say much, just that she remembered something from Bath, something about Henry Blackwood she hadn't seen clearly at the time. She said she now knew what it meant, and that she was afraid. Asked if I could come. I took the next opportunity. "Forgive the question," said Graves. "But what was your connection to her?" Grange hesitated, then sighed. "We were friends. I was a junior clerk at her father's solicitors. We corresponded for a while after her engagement ended. There was talk then, unconfirmed, that Henry Blackwood had been involved in a small-scale embezzlement scheme, using trust accounts to hide temporary losses. Ivy had access to certain client files. I believe she discovered something, or suspected." "But she never told the police?" Miss Marple asked. "She wanted to protect someone. A woman, I think, perhaps involved unintentionally. She said she stepped already hurt enough people." Graves made a note. "And do you think Blackwood was involved?" Grange's eyes narrowed. "I am sure of it, but it was never proven. His father paid off one of the complaints. The rest were buried." Miss Marple's hands remained folded. She said she was afraid again. she prompted. Yes, she said. Someone was watching her. That something had been disturbed. Something buried. Graves and Miss Marple exchanged a look. That evening, Miss Marple walked once again to the churchyard. This time she carried a small gardening trowel. The spot beneath the yew hedge had darkened again with rain. She knelt, careful as always, and brushed the surface gently with the trowel. Within minutes, her efforts yielded something unexpected, a small wooden matchbox, weather-worn and mud-caked. It opened easily. Inside, protected by waxed paper, was a torn page from what appeared to be a ledger. Faintly printed names and numbers, some circled, some crossed out. She folded the paper, slipped it into her pocket, and returned home. At dusk, Inspector Graves arrived, summoned by a brief note she had sent via the vicar's nephew. "I believe," she said, handing him the page, "this is what Ivy found again. Something she kept from Bath, and thought destroyed. Or perhaps someone else buried it here, out of panic, when it resurfaced." Graves turned it over. "These are client name, and numbers next to them," Miss Marple added. "Amounts, perhaps, or case numbers. The kind of thing a nervous young solicitor might hope no one would miss, especially if a helpful young woman offered to dispose of the paper on his behalf out of misguided loyalty." Graves nodded, slowly. "If this ties Blackwood to financial misconduct, it may," said Miss Marple. "But more importantly, it gives someone motive. Ivy may have threatened to reveal this, or even hinted at it, to the wrong person. She wrote to Mr. Grange. Perhaps she spoke to someone else as well." "Blackwood," Graves muttered. "Or the woman she meant to protect," Miss Marple said quietly. "We have not yet considered that the guilty party may not be the most obvious one. That the guilty party may not be the most obvious one. The Ivy was afraid. Yes, that afraid of what she might cause, as much as what she remembered." Graves pocketed the ledger scrap. "We hold Blackwood for questioning. He have to explain this." Miss Marple said nothing. But later that night, as she sat with her knitting untouched in her lap, she considered a different possibility. Ivy had protected someone once, and someone who had worn a white bonnet, crouched near the grave, and disturbed the earth, not with spades, but with bare hands. The figure seen that night had been tallish, but also hunched. She thought of Clara Willis. She thought of Celandine Reston, and she remembered that fear can hide not only guilt, but complicity. Chapter 7. Rain spattered against the windows of Miss Marple's parlour the next morning, tapping in an erratic rhythm, as though nature itself were impatient for the truth. The unearthed ledger scrap sat folded neatly on her mantel beside a vase of wilting marigolds. Ivy's name wasn't on it, nor was Henry Blackwood's, but its existence changed the shape of everything. Miss Marple stirred her tea, untouched. She was no longer thinking only of Blackwood. She was thinking of why Ivy Reston had never gone to the authorities in Bath, of whom she had tried to shield, and why, having protected that person once, she had started to fear them. Guilt was a powerful force, but gratitude, even misplaced, could be stronger still. She rose, donned her raincoat, and stepped out with a quiet purpose. This time she did not walk toward Ivy's cottage or the churchyard. She walked to the vicarage. Clara Willis answered the door, surprised to see her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, brushing flour from her apron. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wonder, Miss Marple said, if you be kind enough to speak with me for a few minutes, somewhere quiet. Clara hesitated. The Reverend and Mrs. Allerton are out, visiting an elderly parishioner. You can come into the kitchen. I was just finishing the shortbread. They sat at the scrubbed pine table. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and warm butter. I spoke with Mr. Lester Grange, Miss Marple began, an acquaintance of Ivy Weston from her time in Bath. Clara paled slightly, though her expression didn't change. He said, Ivy protected someone, Miss Marple continued. Someone entangled in the same scandal that ruined her engagement. She kept quiet, even when it cost her peace. And then, when things resurfaced, she became afraid. Clara said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I believe you knew Ivy before she came to Little Dithering. Clara Sepp's hand froze around her teacup. That's not. She stopped, swallowed. It wasn't public knowledge. No, said Miss Marple. But I noticed how you spoke of her, the way you left the bonnet, the way you feared being seen, and Ivy Sepp's words to Henry Blackwood. Said, I kept your secret once. Sipst. Clara Sepp's eyes shimmered with moisture. She wasn't cute talking to him, she whispered. Not really. She was talking to me. Miss Marple waited. I worked in the same office in Bath, just as a temp, filing, typing. I was barely out of school. Henry took an interest in me, or pretended to. He asked me to help him move some papers late one evening. Client files, he said. I didn't question it, but Ivy did. Clara Sepp's voice broke now. She found me crying. The next day, I hadn't told anyone, but she knew. She said she'd take care of it. She confronted him, but instead of reporting him, she offered him a bargain. He'd leave quietly, and she'd destroy the documents tying him to the misappropriation. She made me promise never to speak of it. Said I could start fresh. And you came here, Miss Marple said gently. I followed her. Clara whispered. I couldn't bear it. The guilt. She gave up everything. Her reputation, her career. She took the fall, so I would instead. I owed her everything. Miss Marple Sepp's voice was very soft. Did she begin to doubt her choice? Clara nodded. After the letter started, when Henry came to the fair, she told me. She kept a record of one document, buried it, just in case. She said, if anything happened to her, someone had to know the truth. And did you go to the churchyard that night? Miss Marple asked. Clara closed her eyes. Yes, but I didn't hurt her. I swear, I just wanted to find it before someone else did. I knew what she meant, where she hidden it. I wore a bonnet to keep from being recognized. I didn't mean to be seen. Miss Marple nodded. And the second visit? Clara flushed. I saw Henry near the church the next morning. Before anyone knew she was dead, he was looking toward the graveyard. I thought he might know that he tried to find the paper. Miss Marple placed a hand over Clara's trembling fingers. Thank you, she said. You should been very brave. After Clara left the room, Miss Marple sat in silence. The storm outside had passed, but the sky remained heavy. Clara's confession explained many things, but not everything. Miss Marple still could not shake one question. If Ivy had confided in Clara, trusted her, and buried the document for safekeeping, why had she suddenly reached out to Leicester Grange 3 days before her death? Why had she written, "I remember now, I know what I didn't before"? What had changed? And more curiously still, what had she remembered? That evening, Inspector Graves returned with news. "Blackwood Sepp's story is unraveling," he said. "The document we found matches a case he oversaw, one that was quietly settled. His father claims no knowledge, but more importantly—" Graves opened a small envelope. "This was found in Henry Sepp's lodgings, crumpled at the bottom of a drawer. It's Sepp's a second copy of the same client record." Miss Marple leaned forward. So he retrieved it, or had another version all along. Either way, it supports the theory that he wanted the paper buried, literally and figuratively. Miss Marple read the document slowly. Then she frowned. "This version has one name missing." Graves blinked. "What?" "Here, look," she said, pointing. "The copy Ivy left in the matchbox listed 6 clients. This one lists 5. Graves took the papers, comparing them side by side. "You still right. And the missing name," Miss Marple said, "is Celandine Reston." They looked at one another. "She was involved," Graves said slowly. "Possibly. Or implicated by Ivy," Miss Marple murmured. "Either way, someone removed her name, someone who had access to both versions." She stood. "I believe it's 6th time I visited Celandine again. Imunda. But this time, Inspect Dine again. Imunda. But this time, Inspector, I stood being most obliged. If you waited just outside the door." Chapter 8. The Reston cottage stood quiet under the lowering sky, its shutters half drawn, and the front steps still wet from the morning's rain. Celandine Reston answered the door with her usual tight smile, though Miss Marple noted the woman's blouse, buttoned unevenly, and her cuff bore a faint ink smear. "Miss Marple," she said, "hidden. I hope this isn't stat about the cottage. I've only just spoken with the solicitor." "Not the cottage," Miss Marple said gently. "Something rather more delicate. May I come in?" There was a pause, but propriety prevailed. "Very well," Celandine replied, stepping aside, "though I can sit to imagine what else there is to say." Miss Marple entered the small sitting room once more, casting a slow glance across the space. It was neater than before, but the fireplace bore no ash, and the mirror above the mantel had been wiped recently. Too recently. The faint scent of white spirit lingered in the air. "Did you burn something?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Celandine blinked. "Pardon?" "There. Spets a smell. Solvent, not smoke. More like cleaning fluid." "I cleaned the hearth," Celandine said. "I thought it would be better to freshen things." Miss Marple nodded and sat. "I wonder," she said, as calmly as if she were asking after a neighbor Sepp's cat, "why your name was on one version of a client ledger and not on the other." The silence that followed was thin and cold. "I don't just know what you mean." Miss Marple studied her. 6 names on the copy Ivy buried. 5 on the one found in Mr. Blackwood Sepp's drawer. The one that Sepp's missing. Yours. Celandine did not blink. "That Sepp's ridiculous. I imagine Ivy didn't know your name had ever been added. Or perhaps she suspected it too late. It was only after she wrote to Lester Grange that she said she remembered something she hadn't said before. Miss Marple let the words settle like fine dust. I believe she realized the discrepancy. Perhaps she'd seen the original once, long ago, and when she unearthed her own copy, she noticed what didn't match. Perhaps your name had been added to the files by someone who thought you wouldn't notice, or perhaps removed by someone who feared she would. Celandine's best face was pale. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple said. "You arrived the morning after her death, unannounced. You claimed Ivy was frightened, but you bowed and word and never said of what. You refused to speak to the police, and when asked to give details, you offered only vague accusations toward Henry Blackwood." She paused, her voice softening. "You wanted the suspicion to stay where it was most convenient, but Ivy may have realized that the person she had been protecting wasn't the only one with something to lose." Celandine stood abruptly. "I think this conversation is over." "I'm afraid not," said Inspector Graves, stepping into the room through the now open front door. Celandine turned, startled. Her face hardened. "You sep no warrant." Graves held up a slip of paper. "I do now, and we serve matched handwriting samples from Ivy Sip's diary to a note you tried to destroy in this very fireplace. Half of it survived." Miss Marple opened her handbag and produced a folded page, brittle with partial burns. Harvard Graves placed it gently beside the half-scorched logs. Only fragments remained, but 2 lines stood out, blackened at the edges. "Can Spec believe it was her all along?" The ledger, her name, Celandine. Miss Marple met her eyes. "Hester Race. She meant to confront you, didn't she? Ivy was going to send the original to the authorities, but first she wrote you a letter, perhaps even invited you to the churchyard to show you what she found." Celandine stared at the fire grate. "She betrayed me. She discovered you," Miss Marple said calmly. "There is a difference." A long silence followed. Then Celandine sat down. "She promised to destroy the copy," she said. Her voice was quieter now, clipped and cool. "I didn't ask her to, but once she did, it was convenient. My name was on the 6th file, not for theft. I didn't take a farthing, but I approved the signature. I didn't question it. I was trying to help Henry balance the accounts, just temporarily. I believed him, and I recovered for us both." "And when the buried copy surfaced again?" Graves asked. "I panicked. I came here when she called. She never even accused me, just said she thought someone had altered the original. She wanted to do the right thing. Esther, I couldn't let her." Graves's jaw tightened. "You poisoned her." "I used a tincture she kept in her cabinet. She had it for years. Foxglove extract. Herbal, she thought. Enough of it, and well, the symptoms would look natural." She said. "She felt faint at the fair. I slipped it into her tea that night, just enough to finish what had already begun." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You didn't even check if she had sent the letter to the police?" "I did check," Celandine snapped. "I broke into her desk before the housekeeper found her. That's when I saw the second copy was still there. I burned the letter she was writing. I thought it was done." Graves moved to handcuff her. Celandine stood calmly and offered her wrists. "She shouldn't have kept digging," she said. almost to herself. "No," said Miss Marple, rising slowly. "But I think she hoped that someone she once protected might have changed." That evening, the village of Little Dithering breathed again, though not with ease. There were no celebrations, only a quiet, slow return to rhythm, the way one might resume walking after a stumble, testing the weight on an injured foot. Clara Willis brought shortbread to Miss Marple Sip's cottage, tears in her eyes. "She never told me it was Celandine," she whispered. "All this time I thought it had been Henry." Miss Marple took her hand. "We are all most afraid of those we want to believe innocent," she said gently. "Even Ivy." And as the sun dipped beyond the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, and the final letter Ivy had written, a copy retrieved from Grange after the arrest. "I thought I was wrong about her, but memory is like light. If it shines long enough, it will show what's hidden." Chapter 9. The next morning, Little Dithering wore an air of reluctant calm, the sort of hush that follows a thunderclap, not quite peace, but exhaustion. Gossip was now wrapped in cotton, passed carefully from mouth to mouth, more subdued than scandalous. Celandine Reston had been taken into custody at dawn, leaving behind the ivy-shrouded cottage and its emptied sitting-room. The windows were shuttered, and the garden gate and its emptied sitting-room. The windows were shuttered, and the garden gate hung ajar in the wind. At the vicarage, Clara Willis sat at the edge of the kitchen table, her cup untouched. Miss Marple had arrived with a modest parcel of scones, and no request for thanks. Clara had not said much since the arrest, and Miss Marple did not pressure her. She told me I owed her nothing. Clara said at last, "The morning after Ivy died, I thought it was grief or anger. But she was warning me." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "She loved Ivy in her own way," Clara continued. "That she also resented her for knowing the truth, for holding that piece of paper, I think, even before the letter was sent, even before she saw it again. She must Sip feared the day would come." "Guilt has a long shadow," Miss Marple said gently, "and resentment grows best when watered with fear." Clara looked down at her hands. "I should have told the police everything sooner." "You told the truth when it mattered most," said Miss Marple. "And in these affairs, that is rarer than people think." Clara nodded slowly. She would carry the wound of this for years, but Miss Marple had no doubt she would recover. Truth, even painful, had a curious way of allowing the heart to breathe again. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves returned for a final word. "I suppose I should thank you," he said, his tone not unfriendly. "You saw what we missed." Miss Marple smiled. "You would have seen it too, eventually." Graves folded his hands. "We said spoken to Henry Blackwood again. He says cooperating. Insists he didn't let in. No, Ivy had kept the ledger copy. Claims he thought she Sept destroyed everything long ago." "And do you believe him?" Graves exhaled. "I believe he Sep's guilty of arrogance and cowardice, but not of murder. And with Ivy Sep's death now explained, I doubt we still get more than financial misconduct to stick." Miss Marple nodded. "It is often the case that the most damaging crimes leave no blood." "True enough," Graves muttered. "Still, the file will stay open. The Bath incident will be re-investigated. Some justice, perhaps, will yet be done." He stood, "You sec done more good here than you know." When he left, Miss Marple took her time cleaning up the parlour. It had grown cluttered in recent days. Notes, tea rings, the faint drift of fireplace ash near the hearth. She collected the ledger scrap, the half-burned letter, and Ivy's final journal page, placing them in an envelope to be returned to the authorities. Only the bonnet remained on her table, folded neatly. Its pale ribbon had frayed from being trampled, a fragile thing, out of place from the start. She would keep it, not as evidence, but as a reminder. That evening, the vicar announced during evensong that a quiet memorial would be held for Ivy Weston on Sunday. Miss Marple attended, wearing a dark lilac scarf and sitting midway down the aisle beside Clara. The eulogy was modest. Ivy had not been widely loved, nor entirely understood, but her death now carried a different weight. Not just a tragedy, but a reckoning. Afterward, the congregation filtered slowly out into the dusk. Miss Hartnell dabbed her eyes and whispered to the vicar's wife, "Such a sad thing, dear Ivy. I always thought there was something watchful about her, as if she saw more than she said." Mrs. Allerton nodded. "Or perhaps she did." Outside, the air was cool and clear. Clara lingered by the gate, her hands folded. "Do you think she knew what Celandine would do?" Miss Marple looked toward the headstones, their crooked lines softened by ivy and lichen. "I think she knew the risk," she said quietly, "but she also knew the cost of silence, and in the end, she chose not to carry it any more." They stood in silence for a time. As the church bells began to ring their final hour, Clara spoke again. "Will you stay for tea?" Miss Marple smiled. "I should like that very much." And as they walked together down the lane, the village returned, inch by inch, to itself. Not the same, never the same, but stitched back together, as such places often are, by routine and memory and the quiet, enduring grace of truth. Chapter 10. 1 week after Ivy Weston's quiet memorial, the rhythms of Little Dithering had begun to settle once more. The village fair bunting had long been taken down, leaving only faint knots of twine clinging to lampposts. The parish notice board now advertised a harvest choral recital. Ivy's name no longer lingered in casual conversation, but her shadow had not entirely lifted. In Miss Marple's sitting room, the fire was burning low. She sat with her needlepoint, but hadn't sewn a stitch in half an hour. Her thoughts drifted, not to Ivy, nor even to Celandine Weston, but to something less settled. There was a detail still tugging at her. The letter found in Henry Blackwood's drawer, the copy with the missing name. Yes, it had seemed convenient, an effort to deflect guilt, or perhaps mislead, but in retrospect, it was too convenient. Henry had no reason to edit the list. He had hoped Ivy destroyed it entirely. Why bother falsifying a copy he believed would never be found? And Celandine, calculating though she was, hadn't replaced the original with a forgery. She'd only tried to retrieve and destroy it. Once Ivy told her it had resurfaced. So who, then, had prepared the altered version? And why had it ended up with Henry at all? The question sat uneasily with Miss Marple. Later that morning, she took her usual route through the village and stopped at the post office for stamps. Mr. Elliston, the stationer and part-time postmaster, greeted her with his usual officious cheer. "Back to writing, Miss Marple. Letters, mostly." tidying things up. He handed her a packet. "Ah, yes. Now, while I have you, a curious thing turned up. Remember the ledger scrap you passed to the inspector? The one in the matchbox?" Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Yes, I found something like it," Elliston said, lowering his voice. "Stuffed inside an old hymn book donation. I start to have thrown it out, but I recognized the handwriting. Figured it looked like that," Miss Reston said. He reached behind the counter and produced a folded sheet. Miss Marple opened it slowly. It was the top half of a ledger page, the companion to the bottom half she had unearthed weeks ago. 6 names, each with sums beside them. And at the bottom, in faded ink, initialed by M.H. Miss Marple frowned. That name did not match either Ivy Reston or Celandine Reston. She turned to Mr. Elliston. "Nate," she asked, "do you know who that might be?" He squinted. "Not offhand. Doesn't spring a bell locally. But it rang a bell for Miss Marple. And doesn't spring a bell locally. But it rang a bell for Miss Marple. Mr. H. Margaret Henshaw. Miss Henshaw, the vicar's bookkeeper, and a quiet figure barely noticed in village events. She had not been present at the fair, nor had she been particularly vocal about Ivy's death. But 2 years ago, she had spent time in Bath, volunteering at the same parish Ivy once attended. A small, neat woman with a keen mind for figures and a gift for remaining unseen. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, the midday light was beginning to dim with cloud. She was greeted by the housekeeper, who informed her that Miss Henshaw was upstairs in the vicar's office. "May I?" Miss Marple asked. The housekeeper, startled, nodded. She found Margaret Henshaw at the large desk, a pencil poised over a ledger. "Miss Marple, I hope I stand not interrupting." "Not at all. Just balancing the choir fund." Miss Marple stepped inside, laid the folded page on the desk. "I believe this is your handwriting." There was a pause. Then, "Yes, I initialed those figures, but I don't see why it matters." "It matters," said Miss Marple gently, "because this list does not match the one Ivy Reston buried." Margaret Henshaw's fingers tensed slightly on the pencil. "Ivy," Miss Marple continued, "trusted someone to compile the records from Bath, a second person, apart from Celandine and Henry Blackwood, someone who could handle figures, had access to documents, and remained unthreatening, someone Ivy never suspected of altering names. I only adjusted the order," Margaret said, her voice even, not the contents. "Yet your version was the one Henry Blackwood had in his drawer," said Miss Marple, "and it was missing Celandine Sepp's name." Silence. "I didn't do it for him," Margaret said at last. "I did it for Ivy." Miss Marple waited. "She asked me to help her tidy the files when she left Bath," Margaret continued. "She said she couldn't carry it any more, that she had made her choices, that she didn't want it to ruin anyone else's life. Not Celandine, not Henry, not Clara. So she asked me to alter the list, to hide one name. A gesture of peace, she called it." "But she kept the original," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes," Margaret admitted, "in case she changed her mind. And when she began to fear again, I think she did, that she never told me." "She didn't suspect you?" "No," said Margaret. "She thought I was safe." Miss Marple studied her. "You didn't know Celandine would kill her?" "No," said Margaret, with something like pain flickering in her expression. "But I enabled it. I helped confuse the truth. I let the past stay buried." She looked down at the page. "I was wrong." Miss Marple nodded. "You weren't the cause, but you were the veil." Miss Henshaw folded the page neatly and placed it atop the choir ledger. "What now?" "I think," Miss Marple said, rising, "you speak to Inspector Graves, and you tell him everything." Miss Henshaw stood and did not resist. That evening, Miss Marple walked home through streets lined with mist. Another layer had been pulled back. Celandine had committed the act, but others had contributed to the silence that made it possible. Ivy had not been betrayed once, but gradually, through a chain of well-meaning omissions. At home, she returned the bonnet to its shelf, now fully understood. A token not only of the murder, but of everything Ivy had carried, of guilt and protection, of secrets passed between women, soft and deadly. And as she sipped her evening tea, Miss Marple did not feel triumph. She felt sorrow, but also a quiet satisfaction. The truth, every bit of it, had finally emerged. Chapter 11. The following Thursday, an envelope arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was plain cream, addressed in a hand that had once been firm, but now betrayed the faint shakiness of someone who had not slept well. Inside was a single sheet of writing paper. "Dear Miss Marple, I have spoken with Inspector Graves. I have told him all. He assures me no criminal charges will follow. Still, I feel something irretrievable has passed from me. If you are willing, I would like to speak with you once more, quietly. Tea tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Margaret Henshaw." Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it inside her notebook. She wasn't surprised. People who unburdened their secrets rarely felt lighter. They simply became aware of the weight they had long carried. At 3 sharp the next afternoon, she arrived at the vicarage. The housekeeper showed her into the modest back garden, where a small table had been laid beneath the budding pear tree. Margaret Henshaw waited, already seated, a fine bone china cup untouched in front of her. "Thank you for coming," she said, as Miss Marple took her place. "You were quite brave," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. "Few people speak the truth once they sip hidden it so long." Margaret's hands twitched in her lap. "I wish I could say it was for noble reasons, but I was just tired of holding it all inside." They sat for a moment, the silence between them filled with wind through leaves and the low hum of bees. Ivy did instead want Celandin's life destroyed. Margaret said suddenly, even after all of it, I think she hoped that naming the truth would bring peace. But she was wrong. Some truths don't settle. They fracture. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Truth doesn't promise peace, only clarity. Margaret nodded. Clarity, then, that I can live with. They spoke a little more of small village things, the state of the parish roof, the growing hedges along the chapel wall. Nothing more of Ivy or the case. Miss Marple did not press. The healing was not hers to measure. That evening, Inspector Graves stopped by with a final folder. "This," he said, placing it on her table, "is the complete report. I thought you ought to see it, just in case anything felt left unfinished." Miss Marple opened the folder slowly. Inside were the summaries. Ivy Reston's final letter, Margaret Henshaw's statement, Clara Willis's signed account, the names listed on the recovered ledger page, the results of the toxicology report, confirming digitalis. It was all there, clear, precise, complete. "Henry Blackwood?" she asked. "Under formal investigation," Graves said. "Staff police are reopening 2 older complaints. But unless we find more," he said, "I'll walk away with shame, not sentence." Miss Marple folded the file closed. She said, "I'll carry it either way." Graves nodded once and left her to it. For a long while after, Miss Marple sat watching the fire flicker low in the hearth, not reading, not knitting, just listening to the creak of the house. Reading, not knitting, just listening to the creak of the house and the hush of the wind brushing the eaves. Justice had come, not swiftly, nor with grandeur, but in the only way it could, piece by piece, through memory and courage and stubborn pursuit. Not a courtroom drama, but a village undone and then gently restitched. The next morning brought one final encounter. At the market, Miss Marple ran into Clara Willis. The young woman's eyes were brighter now, her shoulders straighter. "Have you heard?" she said, with a faint smile. "I said I've been offered a job in Chipping Woodbury, assistant at the library. They need someone good with organization. I can't think of anyone better suited," Miss Marple said warmly. Clara hesitated, then added, "I think I still go. Not to run from anything, just to begin again." "Beginnings are best made honestly," said Miss Marple. "You, Sep, earned that." Clara nodded, then turned to go. The weight behind her finally loosened. As Miss Marple made her way home, she paused by the churchyard. Ivy's grave had not yet received a stone, but a simple wooden marker stood in its place, with fresh rosemary tied around it. Ivy Reston. She remembered what others forgot. A line chosen by Clara, Miss Marple suspected. Fitting. That afternoon, as the church bells marked the hour, Miss Marple once more tidied her desk. She folded the notes she'd taken throughout the case. Dates, names, weather observations, things half heard at market stalls, and tucked them into a small envelope labeled simply, "The Bonnet Case." Then she placed it among the others in her writing desk drawer. And with a quiet breath, Miss Marple stood, placed the kettle on, and returned to her embroidery. The mystery was over. But the watching, the listening, that never stopped. Because in Little Dithering, as in all places, human nature continued, quiet, frail, forgetful, and dangerous. Chapter 12. Autumn arrived properly to Little Dithering. 2 weeks after Ivy Reston's memorial, the leaves turned crisp at their edges. The hedgerows wore gold, and chimney smoke curled steadily above the rooftops. Life resumed its gentle pace, but with just enough silence around certain corners to mark that something had happened here, something that, though resolved, would never be fully forgotten. In her sitting room, Miss Marple stood before the window, watching 2 schoolchildren play with conkers beneath the chestnut tree across the lane. They shrieked with delight, the shrillness of their voices rising and falling like bird-song. Innocent noise, for now. The kettle clicked off behind her. On the table, a letter lay open, one of several she had received since the close of the case. This one was from Inspector Graves. "The final Bath inquiry is closed. Blackwood has stepped down from his father's firm. No criminal charge. His father shielded him again, but his reputation is in ruins. Celandine Weston has been moved to a private institution. The trial proved brief. Her confession stood. The doctors agree. She suffers from a compulsive guilt disorder, marked by resentment when it turns inward. Uncommon, but not unknown. Clara Willis has taken the post in Chipping Woodbury. Margaret Henshaw continues at the vicarage. Quiet, but more open, they say. She leaves ledger entries, unsigned now, and the original bonnet. We returned it to your safekeeping, Graves. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly and placed it with the others. She had not intended to keep the bonnet, but when the parcel arrived, she had not been able to throw it away. It sat now inside her linen chest, its ribbon retied, its brim gently pressed, not a trophy, but a remembrance of what Ivy had tried to say, in a village not yet ready to hear it. That afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the Allertons, a modest gathering, just the vicar's wife, Miss Hartnell, and one of the younger parish girls who'd won a poetry prize, the sort of gathering the village prized, safe, decorative, and untouched by scandal. Still, Miss Marple noticed how every conversation bent slightly around the absence of certain names. "We mustn't forget the fair next year," said Miss Hartnell brightly, stirring her tea with too much purpose. "Perhaps something simpler. No tea tent, just cakes and crafts." "I thought the tea tent did very well," said the vicar's wife, glancing toward Miss Marple with a quick smile. Yes, Miss Hartnell allowed. "But you know, perhaps we oughtn't to tempt fate so soon after all that. Unpleasant." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Unpleasantness passes more quickly in conversation than in truth." There was a pause. Then the young parish girl piped up innocently. "Is it true, Miss Marple, that you solved it? The whole thing?" Miss Hartnell looked scandalized. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Solved, dear? No, I listened. Excepts what Ivy needed most, I think. Someone to listen fully." She did not elaborate. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. When she returned home, a small envelope had been left through the letterbox. It bore no stamp, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, folded neatly, was a newspaper clipping from a Bath Society column, dated 3 years ago. Mr. Henry Blackwood seen leaving the chambers of N.B.R., financial advisor, in discussion with Miss C.R., formerly of Belgrave Square. No note accompanied it, but Miss Marple understood. There had been someone else watching all along, someone who had followed the quiet threads before Ivy ever came to Little Dithering, someone who saw how quickly protection could become erasure. Miss Marple placed the clipping in her file. The bonnet case, though closed, still whispered faintly around its edges. Like all true mysteries, its deepest truths had not been shouted, but murmured quietly and painfully until someone thought to hear them. That evening, Miss Marple sat down to write. The peculiar thing about murder, when it comes to a village, is how little it changes the architecture. The hedges still grow, the tea still steeps, the market opens, the choir sings, but something invisible has shifted, not the shape of the place, but the way people breathe inside it. Ivy Reston was not a martyr, nor a heroine. She was a young woman who carried too much: secrets, guilt, memory. She tried to protect others, and it cost her peace. She tried to speak, and it cost her life, but she left behind something rare. She left behind the truth. And sometimes, in a village like ours, that is enough. When she finished, Miss Marple sealed the page and placed it in her journal. She turned down the lamp. The fire glowed softly in the grate. From the linen chest, the bonnet remained unseen, but not forgotten. In Little Dithering, the wind picked up again. It carried with it no secrets now, only the sound of autumn settling in.